Hi, I'm John Stevens.
This is Matt Russell.
And this is Pod Have Mercy.
This is Pod Have Mercy.
So, you had a birthday. Like today?
Today.
Happy birthday.
Oh.
There's even a cake.
We're still going.
There's even a cake for you.
Yeah,
Happy birthday.
Thank you, John.
And this week's coffee is
Oh,
brought to you by, who's this week?
Actually brought to you by.
Java Pura. And we have shipping channel and Java Pura, locally roasted in Texas. Excellent. Look, dude, any brother or sister who wants to send us some coffee, I can tell you. But I can tell you, those are both excellent.
Oh, yeah. That's nice.
Good. It's going to pair well with that cake. So,
Right.
how old are you now?
I'm a 42, John.
42? Good
I
for
am,
you.
yeah. No, I turned 53 today.
53.
That feels old to me. I don't feel old, but that's old.
Well, 53 is actually like the new 33, except during COVID-19. During COVID-19, it's like 74. You know, they used to,
I'm in a vulnerable population.
No, for a while it was like, everybody said, 70's the new 50 and 80's the new 60. It's
now
like
70's
now 50 is the new 70
new 78.
during COVID. It's like you skew up instead of down. I just feel unhealthy. COVID I feel
Just makes you
unhealthy.
feel like,
I've gained. Yeah, these are interesting days. And I think that the vast majority of time, I don't know. I think the vast majority of time has to be spent not on looking backwards, but where do we go from here?
Absolutely.
What do things look like? I think part of the reason that the racial components are so in focus is because we're in a pandemic as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in a place, in a space where we see everything differently. So race we see it differently. And that's uncomfortable for people. I can't tell you how many people, they just want to go back to the way things were. We're not going to go back to the way things were.
Never.
It's not going to happen anytime soon. I'm real big into managing expectations. As Barry Schwartz says, the secret to happiness is low expectations. And this roller coaster ride of pandemic is not going to level out. As much as you want to fight it, as much as you want to post all this data about how masks are a conspiracy, as much as you want to post about how this is some false thing to control people and turn everyone into Democrats. The reality is it's here and it's not going away anytime soon until we get a vaccine. That's going to be a while. So we're going to have to figure out how to deal with this. And it's interesting to me that a lot of the reaction in battle is more rooted in our unwillingness to change than it is to really address the real issues of COVID or economic insecurity or racial division. I don't know. It's a compensatory mechanism. As Shine says, we're always, or maybe it's Singy, we're always fighting hard to protect ourselves against threat and embarrassment. Those are the two things. We're doing everything in our power to protect ourselves against threat and embarrassment.
That's good.
That's the way we're wired.
It seems like what runs underneath all that is just this cultural fear, the fear of the threat or the fear of being embarrassed. And I keep coming back to what you and I constantly are talking about in the Gospels, this gospel that roots us in love, that roots us in our communal life together and the goodness of acting out towards others with real deep compassion and care. And I think that's what makes us human. It's the only way forward, I think this is really helping me understand what it means to be a Christian, not just in what I believe in my head, but the way I act in the world. And it's a real summonsing to do that in practical ways.
I mean, it's like it's this whole thing about, we're talking about sitting at the feet of the rabbi.
Right.
There's the way rabbinical teaching happens is learning, growing, assimilating. And I think a lot of us in our Christian discipleship, we got the learning and kind of some of the growing. But now we're being tested to see how much of this life of the rabbi we are assimilating into our, not just our practice, but our words and our worldview.
Yes. Yeah.
So, well, Mark, I'm John Stevens. It's nice to meet you by Zoom.
Nice to meet you as well. Nice to meet you too.
We're glad you're here. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, Matt, you want to introduce Marc? And then, Marc, I think it'd be great first to just tell us a little bit about what you're doing and organization you're involved in. So,
yeah. I met Marc actually recently through a friend and a colleague, Rachel Snyder, who's at Project Curate and also a postdoc fellow at Rice University, has been kind of working on I think she did her Ph.D. in evangelical kind of churches in South Africa, and kind of both kind of white churches that were kind of leading the charge, and also white churches that proved to be barrier to social change there, and kind of was looking at different dynamics of those. And she told me recently, oh, I've got a friend that you've got to meet. I think that there'd be a lot that y'all have to talk about. And so meeting you, and also then being as I've emailed you, I've kind of stalked you on your podcast, and which has been really great, and which I'd love to kind of promote here, and then also would love to kind of riff off of your last podcast around some of the dynamics that you and your co-hosts were talking about. But I know that you're living in Louisiana from North Carolina. You're a theologian and a pastor, or have at least pastored in your history. Can you kind of tell us about who you are and what you're involved in right now?
Sure. So I grew up in North Carolina, very rural area, eastern part of the state, fundamentalist Baptist background. Mm-hmm. That was all I knew. There wasn't much of a mainline presence out in that part of the world, and grew up, and in my 20s started to have my eyes open to some things, both theologically and socially. The area where I grew up, prior to my birth, at least throughout the 60s and 70s, had been a hotbed of Klan activity. Huh. And that history lingered, through the 80s, 90s, and to today. And anyway, it's sort of at the northern end of what's called the Black Belt or the Cotton Belt. So in terms of racial demographics, it was always pretty evenly mixed, black and white. And sometimes, like the Mississippi Delta region where I live now, could be majority African American and minority white throughout those regions. And it traces back to the history of slavery and plantation style, farming and things like that. And anyway, those communities you can still find, and that's true with the Delta too. But anyways, over time, I, felt called into ministry at an early age and pursued that call and went to seminary, and then did more work in theology and a Ph.D. program at Garrett Evangelical United Methodist Seminary. So that's my United Methodist background there. And so I started that work back in 2009, and there was a small group of people, Rachel included, as you mentioned, who were starting to begin to talk about what it means to look at theology and the theology that we write and that we preach and that develops in our churches, to what does it mean to take our white identity seriously and to interrogate that and to really look at how whiteness shapes the way we have framed theology in the United States and the way we practice it and things like that, which was a charge that had been given to white theologians for the last 30 or 40 years, going back to James Cone and the beginning of the Black liberation theology movement. And not many white theologians either had the language to do it or were not taking it seriously. And so now it's grown a lot over the last 10 years, where theologians are in churches and congregations where we're trying to look at whiteness. That language has come to the forefront in the last 5, 6, 7 years. That we were trying to do that theologically as well. And so that shaped my dissertation, and my doctoral work was looking at that, and ended up landing here in Louisiana with a nonprofit, a faith-based nonprofit ministry called Together for Hope, which I'll give you a little bit of the background there. It tries to be a resource. We have got communities all over the United States, not communities, we have individuals and ministry presences in communities across the United States where areas of where poverty is very high. And that the Together for Hope on a broader scale has identified places of persistent poverty, meaning where poverty has been at a certain level for more than 3 or 4 decades in a row, where the majority of citizens live in poverty or at or below the poverty line. And so the place where I am in Lake Providence, Louisiana, poverty levels here are very high and have been for 30 or 40 years. And there's a whole history of why that's the case. But so I've been, theologian / organizer / ministry presence in a town that's 80% African-American, 20% white. Segregation levels are still reminiscent of Jim Crow or the 1940s, 1950s. The school systems are still 100%, not by law, but by practice, 100% segregated. Churches, of course, are. So it's been an interesting experience, but it's been good work, and it's been good to be here.
That's great. That's great. I wonder if today, one, again, I want to mention your podcast, and the name of it is Southern White Theologians.
Progressive Southern Theologians.
Progressive Southern Theologians. That's right. I knew there was. I knew I was
white.
With your two white dudes.
We are. Yeah.
And part of what I've really loved about listening to you and just, getting to know you through that work and then through some of the collaborative work that we'll be doing is the way I hear you talk about race and racism, and then also this construct of whiteness seems to be done with a real gentleness and a resoluteness. You're not kind of not saying that we don't have work to do, but you also seem to be taking in the long arc of the work that needs to be done, has been done, and that we're called to do. And I wonder if you could help us understand the construct of maybe just in the beginning, kind of whiteness, because when folks hear that, particularly in white churches, there's kind of this pullback that says, "Wait, I'm white. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not there's all these kind of defenses that go up." And can you help us understand a little of the nuances between what whiteness is and whiteness isn't, and then maybe the call of discipleship in the midst of that?
Yeah. In some ways, and I'll qualify this, whiteness is it's benign in a way. And there's a major caveat coming with that. In terms, whiteness just, to me, signifies the culture in which white people live, the norms, the habits, the customs, the behaviors, the practices, the way we talk. Now that gets played out differently across various regions of the geographical regions, across class backgrounds, of course. Across religious backgrounds. Whiteness doesn't always look the same. It's not one thing. Just like being black or being Hispanic is not a monolithic thing either. There are various ways to embody that and to live into black identity or white identity or Hispanic identity. So in a sense, the term whiteness, understanding it does raise bells because for a lot of our history, whiteness has just been normal. It's just the way things are. It's the way we do things, and the blackness or brownness has been the other. That's been the other way of doing things that we notice that's outside of the pale of what's normal. So whiteness is one attempt just to name the fact that we are enculturated beings, that we have something that is nameable, that describes our customs, are anything. If you would think of the word culture, anything that you would apply to the word culture, that's sort of the way I think of whiteness. The less benign part of that, of course, is how those norms, the way we assume that to be normal, then sort of intentionally sometimes and sometimes unintentionally leads itself to dehumanizing people who are not white. And again, that, creating this category of the racial other And when there's political and social power attached to that and economic power and whatnot, it then creates a lot of the issues that we see around racial injustice. And so whiteness is also a way to try to name these, these cultural, socio-political things that are at work here. So it's both analytical, it's both descriptive. It's some, I think of, well, I'll save that for later. But that's what I start with when I think about whiteness. Yeah.
Okay. And then what's the call of the church amid like the social kind of place that we find ourselves, both with, kind of within the COVID pandemic, and then now with the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, and these calls to reformation on multiple levels, whether that's education or the wage earn gap, maybe the way that communities police. What's the call of the church amid all of this? Do you see what's the work of the church amid all this?
One word that always comes to me when I think about this as a starting point is just simply empathy. And I mean that in a technical way for people who may find themselves resistant to some of the language or to some of the slogans or to some of what they see happening. Many white people are not resistant to that and have supported the movements and concern about COVID or protests in the streets. There have been lots of white people involved in trying to be allies in that respect. But for those who may be a little more squeamish around some of those things, empathy is a great place to start. And it's just, can we stop for a second and imagine what another person might actually be experiencing and feeling, and that what they are experiencing may not be what we experience as white people. That's where the name may not be perfect, but the category or the idea of whiteness is meant to help us think, oh, okay, like I have this sort of enculturated way of being, but that's true for others. And it might look and feel and be different for someone who's not white than it is for us. So starting with empathy is a practice to cultivate. And I don't think that's unrelated to our spirituality and, calls that we see from, the scriptures of ways of being in the world. Listening also, listening is extremely important. That if you find, to the extent that we find ourselves hesitant to buy into something that we see or hear from people of color or folks who are leading some of these movements, or who are challenging some of the comfortable ways that we exist, rather than shutting down and just turning away, just at least trying to listen. That's not an easy task necessarily, but it's a place to start. And again, just to maybe imagine that the realities being described by others are actually true. And that those realities are true, and they may seem foreign to some white people who live in certain parts of the country or who have not been present in communities of color very often, or don't have deep relationships with people of color, significant relationships there. That, again, listening, developing empathy, imagining that, trusting our neighbors and our colleagues who are Black and from different racial backgrounds, that their experience may be different from ours. Those are some beginning points. There are many other things that could, that the church is being called to do as well, but those are a couple of starting points.
What do you think? One of the things, Mark, I grew up in the deep South as well, South Georgia, very segregated neighborhoods and life and mentality. One of the things, and so I think I'm on my own journey, just recognizing a lot of my own ignorance about privilege and all these things that there are a lot of assumptions, like you said. There's whiteness is that was just normal for me. I mean, life has just been normal. And then there's been the other, and I've lived with the other, went to school with the other, played ball with the other, whatever they might be. And now in Houston, living among the other. I think one of the things you said about empathy and listening, I think there are things we can control and things we can't control. And one of the things we can control in this process that I'm learning is I can control my ability to be open. And I'm experiencing a lot of really, I say this carefully, really good Christian people that I've known all my life. I know they love Jesus, and I know that they are Christians. But this is an issue that they really don't know how to find themselves. They don't know how to articulate. They don't know how to process. They're confronted with there's a lot of defensiveness. There's a lot of personalization around race. I've noticed that. I said it last week, ever since we talked with Christian Washington, who's one of our pastors on staff, is that whenever we talk about race, white folk have a tendency to personalize everything. Well, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. I'm fine with everything being equal. But there's also, I'm even sensing from people that said, can y'all just go a week and not talk about racism? Can we just not talk about this anymore? Okay, we get it. That's what, all right, we get it. All right, we get it. We hear it, and it's like we want to go back. I don't know that, how do you address that? How do you speak to that? Something to me about where we are now, and I think you could point to the one issue of George Floyd. I think it's a combination of years and years of leading to this point where this is an inflection point, a pivot point in our culture, in our society. When you see NASCAR, who derives their profits off of all of these groups, and they say no more Confederate battle flag, when they, do what they do and walk alongside of each other, we're in a different place. Right?
Yeah.
We're in a different place. So I guess I'm not ranting. I'm just sort of thinking, processing how I would want to be able to communicate to people around this. And there's also this deflection. There's huge deflection. It's like, I know that's bad, but I can't believe, they point to the looting or the burning of buildings. It's all of deflection, and it's out of our defensiveness and all of these things. How do we begin to have conversations and really invite people in a non-threatening way to really have serious conversations about real issues that sometimes we're not even aware of? I mean, it's there. We kind of know it, but we're being confronted. Some people are being confronted with this for the very first time in real ways. Yeah. It's threatening for them.
A couple of things. I mentioned on this one of the episodes of the podcast recently that social media puts a lot of the people that I follow on social media are either very fervent in their support for the protests right now, or are responding in very deflective and ways. I've got family members and others who I've seen take offense to a lot of what's white family members, a lot of what's happening now. I'm not out here to criticize social media, but it definitely intensifies it. And we're scrolling through our phones lots and lots and lots and lots of times throughout the day. So I think it is present and in front of us a lot more. That's just a reality to name. But I've noticed that, I lost my train of thought. Oh, I know what it was. When I see on social media, when I see calls, that are very, I frame them as sort of like prophetic speech. Like prophetic speech does not delve in nuance. It does not care for pastoral sensitivity. It is, you are wrong. This needs to change. Go fix it. This is broken. Like, do it. If you don't, you're a bad person. Like that's sort of at the heart of the prophetic tradition, which is one part of what it means to be a Christian and to follow in the way of Jesus and whatnot. And I see that. I found it helpful when I'm talking with folks, if I say, a lot of what you see on social media or what's happening in the street, if you see that as a form of prophetic speech that is valuable and is sort of, in a vanguard type of movement that's sort of pointing in the way that we would want society to go, think of it like that. And then also remember, and here's the nuance, but also remember that human beings don't change as quickly as what that type of direct, bold, prophetic speech would make it seem like was possible. Yeah. And so while I think it's necessary as a form of prophetic speech, it is not the thing that's going to get people, changing our psychologies about race, which are deeply, deeply built into the structures of who we are and our very being, the way we move through space. Like those are not easy things to change, and they're not things that change overnight. It's sort of like, I think Christianity already has the language to sort of deal with this. There are some Christian traditions, like the one I was born into, that's more evangelical or revival and revivalistic in nature, where, a conversion experience is something that can happen overnight, right? Like it can be very sudden and direct. And sure, there might be some people out there who see something that happens, or they might read an article or read a book or watch what happened to George Floyd, and maybe a light comes on and it's just a dramatic transformation for them, and they're now woke in terms of their racial consciousness or something like that. We also know in Christianity that there are a lot of people that's not the process they go by, in terms of the development of their spirituality. And I think the same thing is true. The tricky part is not, if you're on that bold prophetic front, you're not trying to give a pass to people, because people are really, truly suffering from systems of racial injustice. But as I said in the podcast, the psychology of race is difficult, and it takes a long time for people to walk that journey, and it is a journey. I mean, that metaphor and that language is there as well. I made the joke on to my co-host the other day. I said, I know a lot of people on social media that are colleagues of mine and friends of mine who are very woke in sense of what's their analysis of what's happening in the world. But I also know that it took them having a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a doctoral degree to get to that level of awareness. It took not always all three of those degrees, but it took a lot of professors, it took a lot of relationships, a lot of mentoring, a lot of privilege, a lot of access to the histories that people otherwise don't know, that we're not taught in K-12 history courses, like the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? Like a lot of people, including myself, didn't know much about that until I was in a master's or a Ph.D. degree program. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to...
Or until we watched The Watchmen.
The Watchmen.
The Watchmen.
Yeah,
seriously, I mean, when I watched this a series on Netflix or something, or one of those things, and it opens
HBO.
with that scene, HBO, and I had to Google that up because I was a history major, and I don't know that I ever was aware of exactly Black Wall Street and Tulsa. I had no idea.
Yeah. So, to understand for white folks that it's not going to happen overnight. There might not even really be a final destination point. Again, that's why I led earlier with the comments about listening and empathy being so important, because it's a long process. I think people who do the work of trying to work with white congregations and white community members, to grow in their awareness of some of these things and these realities, there also needs to be I think there's a benefit to a pastoral touch or a gentle touch when it comes to that, because like any other change in views of society or worldview or theology or whatnot, it's often a long and slow process. With that being said, I think while white people do that kind of work, which is important and necessary, that we also adopt a sense of, well, at least let us not get in the way, of other people who may be farther along in that journey, who are realities and are working for certain types of social change. That we're not trying to slow down that process, but also, guilt and shame just doesn't get us very far at the end of the day. And it's easy to fall into that trap and to personalize everything, or to, and then to want to deflect and things like that. And I don't know that that's productive. It's not very productive at the end of the day. My last thing I'll say too, in this respect, is that when we're talking about this, we always have to keep coming back to the idea that racism can be a personal disposition or a set of views or ideas that we have, but really one of the major concerns is with systems and how it works systemically in our culture. And that's another type of education, another thing to begin to understand. And there's a history to that to learn, and all of these things. And so it's not always about the individual. I think a lot of our language and conversations tends to always go back to what are we doing as individuals about this, or what joke did I tell or not tell, or did I call out my cousin at a Thanksgiving dinner? And I'm interested in those things because those things matter. They're pieces of the fabric. But I'm just as interested in what we're doing at social levels, both municipal, state, federal levels. Like, what kinds of things are we doing to try to make life a bit more just and more fair for people of color? Both of those things have to be. And I think that can alleviate some of the individualized guilt that we might feel, to say, well, okay, I'm going to be on my journey and I'm going to be doing what I can do personally. And then also what's happening at systemic levels that are affecting larger swaths of people besides just me and my next door neighbor or something like that. And I think maybe we can get a little more done if we switch.
What I really like that resonates with me when you said, okay, we might not be there people I know might not be there prophetically ready to do that, but let's just not get in the way. And I think part of our defensive mechanisms, especially with social media, where we can say whatever we think anytime we want, we say things that we think are, what, you know, again, out of defensiveness or whatever, and they're not helpful. They get in the way. I would think that's a really good lesson for us to say, if we're open to being on that journey, can we just not get in the way? And when you talk about, I know for some folks who are on the prophetic end of the spectrum, gradualism is an enemy. You know, the whole idea,
really
whether it be in the LGBTQ inclusivity or racial, it's just like, you're either all there, all then, or you're an enemy. And so as we think about gradualism, I wonder how we find ourselves in that. I think you talk about there's that instantaneous salvation, transformation moment like Paul on the Damascus Road. But then I think there's a lot of stories in the scripture. I think like Nicodemus, who is an ally, and yet he's always right there on the periphery, on the edge, wanting to learn, kind of in the way, not in the way, sort of defending, but not really walking alongside of him. And at the end, he's like, you know what I'm saying? It's like Nicodemus to me is that one really interesting character in John's gospel that John never really ties up with a bow in a real clean and clear way. He's this real tentative kind of in and out character that I've found in my own life I wrestle with and find myself as Nicodemus. And it seems like a lot of us may be in that space as we go to meet Jesus by night to try to figure out what's going on. We defend him in front of other people. Yeah. And then, you know, I don't know, but I really like the idea of the image of, okay, you may not be here or there, but let's not get in the way of the work that other people will be doing.
Yeah.
Right. I used the analogy also of therapy on the last podcast program. I said, no one, you know, if you go to a therapist and the first thing they say to you is that you're an awful human being and you need to go fix yourself, that's a bad therapist, right? Like
some people love those kinds of therapists.
What do you mean? That's not normal?
Some people would love that.
But I mean, we could play off that analogy for a while too. But just, you know, let's say somebody does have an actually bad habit that's hurtful and harmful to another human being. It doesn't mean that how they're treating somebody is okay, and they should just say, oh well, I'm gradually working on it and I'll get there eventually. The psychology of it is that it does take time, and yet at the same time we have to find a way to honor the hurt and the pain and the inequities that are very real and are very present and are very taking its toll on our neighbors as well. And we have to hold both of those things together.
I love that analogy because it kind of understands and presupposes that there are behaviors that are really tied deeply into the way that we have constructed our own lives and our own identities and the culture that we live in, and that we can't even see because they're really normal. You know, and that's where I find both kind of the light of the gospel shining in this other kingdom, you know, that gets talked about, like, oh, there's another way of living that I'm being called to. And there is, there's a gentleness that God has always enacted in my own life in those kinds of changes. It's been resolute, it's been prophetic, but there's also been a deep gentleness that says, come on, you can take a step. You know, you want to be a little more free, you can do this. And so that's the gas oil mix, I think, within kind of pastoral ministry is how do we both say the hard word that needs to be said, but also the gentle process that is resolute that we call people, even ourselves, are called onto. I think, and I hear you talk about that in a way that I haven't heard in that combination before, and I find it to be super helpful. Super helpful.
Another nuance there too is that, and this is something that it's very often seen on social media and in these kinds of conversations, is that the white community, that we don't ask the black community or other racial communities, other people of color, to do that work for us. We don't ask them to be our therapists, to use that use that language again. Because that's not fair. And we can, that learning process. Surely there may be some folks out there who are willing to walk alongside their white sisters and brothers along that journey, but that's not to put that expectation on communities of color to do the education work for us. That's where white leaders need to step up and help do that, because it can feel very, I would imagine that it could feel very uncomfortable and frustrating to have to be in that slow, gradual process, and would much rather show up where you can, be an ally when you can, to the extent that you can, but don't ask us to do that internal work for you.
I found that to be real important.
So, Mark, to sort of the average layperson who would be listening, and they say, I've had some conversations with people that have said to me, who are they can be defensive, they can struggle with this. Like, all right, you tell me, what can I do? What can I do? What's my part then? And sometimes I get that question even from people that are a little antagonistic to the whole conversation. So it's almost like a test. It's like, you tell me what I can do. Again, it over-personalizes it, but still, I think it is interesting for us to start with just a lot of folks that haven't either paid attention, or it's been normal, or they've just been, and now they're starting to at least be open. What are some steps or some just basic starting points, places, things to do that you would give to white folk to say, here's how you can be open in this journey?
When you were giving the example of the person asking that question, it reminded me of the lawyer who approached Jesus and said, "What must I do to be saved?"
That didn't work. That story didn't work out real well for that guy.
and Jesus basically says, "Well, you already know what to do, don't you? Are you really asking me, or are you trying to bait me here?" I think that's the biggest one. I think of that's a big question. I think one of the issues that has been raised, and has been raised very well, are inequities in our criminal justice system. I think both educating ourselves in terms of, I'm thinking of places where we see racial injustice really play out, where it's been inscribed into our system today that doesn't look like maybe the ways that it did in decades past. There's been a lot of awareness being raised around that. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander was a book that was eye-opening to me, that I just did not know. All of the racial inequities that were built into the criminal justice system in terms of how things were prosecuted, in terms of the war on drugs, et cetera. I'm sure there are lots of other resources out there now in addition to Michelle Alexander's book, but that's certainly a great thing in terms of when we're looking at something like what happens with George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor, and we're wondering, are these things aberrant to the way the system works, or are they normalized, parts of how the system work? And I think that book is eye-opening there. I think that there are nonprofits galore that do work based, on racial justice. Find out who they are, do it locally. Look in Houston, ask people who you think might be into this kind of thing, and see, are there ways, if you have the financial means to do so, if there are ways to support the work. I work for a very small nonprofit in the Delta, and I can tell you that the difference that a donation makes, it truly does. Not only asking you to write a check, but that's one thing. Find ways, this is a taller order than it may sound, but I remember a professor once, who's now at Yale Divinity School, he said, one of the most helpful things white people could do would be to actually build relationships of consequence and significance with people of color.
Yes.
In other words, that, relationships, friendships that would, if something negative happens to that person, then it would actually impact your life, not just an acquaintance or someone you would pass in the street. And not, therefore to assume that, I work with somebody, or I pass somebody, in the grocery store or at my child's daycare or something like that, but actually really building significant relationships with people of color. I find ways, respectful ways to actually go and be present in communities and in places that are different than our own, sort of an immersion type of thing. That's another possibility. I would, start there. It kind of depends on where the person is. The internet gives us a ton of information that we would not have had otherwise. That's a good thing and a bad thing. You can find the emotional echo chambers that we live in. We can find anything we want that can affirm our preconceived notions of how the world works. And so I think even being aware of that, and I don't know, I'll stop there. I'm rambling a bit, but that's a good question. And there's, I think the thing about that question that I find difficult to answer is that it presumes that there's maybe a silver bullet that would do it. Like if I just did this one thing or these couple of things, and that might, fix things. And the way racism works in our country is that it's so much more complicated than that. And that's not to evade an answer, because I think some of the things I mentioned are things that can be done. But to also know that just doing one or two things it's still going to be a process, and it's still going to be, it'll still take some work. That's not necessarily easy. I think another suggestion I would say is be willing to be uncomfortable and just sit with that, okay, and even say, even if you disagree with something that you hear or that you're reading or that you're learning or that you're hearing from someone, to say that just because I disagree with what a certain activist or a certain scholar might be saying, there's differentiate between somebody's statement that you may not like and the actually bigger social realities that we're living in. I don't agree with everything I hear every activist say, nor does every activist agree with everything any other activist says. There's always a plethora of opinions, and there's always going to be debate in terms of what are the best ways forward and how to do things within any community. And that includes communities who are fighting for racial justice. It's not a monolith, and not everyone agrees, on the same set of terms and what's most helpful. So I think giving oneself a little bit of grace to say, okay, I heard this. I don't necessarily know that I agree, but there are probably a bunch of other folk out there who are proposing things that can be done that might feel more attainable, or things that I can do in the process or in the meantime.
I think one of the beauties of the era that we live in is that there's a multiplicity of ways of learning. I think about just the documentaries that are out right now, whether it's 13th or The House I Live In, or, there's so many ways of learning particular histories of the way and where we've gotten to. And I realize that part of my journey has been the necessity of both learning some history that was not available to me as a kid growing up, and to really understand a different, that light being shown on a different part of the populace and their whole experience was deeply important. And then also I found my theological training was woefully inadequate when it came to understanding the world in a larger portion than just kind of America or European understandings of theology and who God is. And so that some of that was kind of shaped by a walk down some Latin American theologians. That was kind of particularly important for my own family and the way that my own family is configured. But then that led me to some other theologians of color that was like, oh. When Cone began to critique some of the stalwarts of my own kind of upbringing, whether that was Tillich or whether that was Niebuhr or Barth, I was like, oh, they critiqued all these things, but never did the work in their own context about race. And that helped me to understand kind of the waters that I swam in and swim in, and helped me to be more curious about my own upbringing and about things that were already around me. So I found that to be helpful as well.
Yeah, the history. I acknowledge and claim up front that I am bookish and a scholar, and I love to read. And I sometimes hesitate to just say, "Oh, go read more books or go read more things." Although that is my first inclination, the first thing I would say. But I think you're right too, bringing up just there are lots of documentaries that are out and available, movies that are out and available. There are things that other than books that one can do. I'm rolling back through books I read over the years, like American Apartheid, which talks about housing segregation, and the redlining and those practices. The new Jim Crow, of course, I've mentioned. There are, of course, I'm going to blank on the name at the moment, but there are great books that have just come out about the history of racial ideas in the United States that are great reads.
Stamped it from the beginning.
Yeah, stamped from the beginning. And that book is not the first book to do that. There are there are other resources out there that cover those ideas as well. But that's an excellent resource. White Fragility, White Rage. Those are two separate books that have been written recently as well. And if you don't know where to go, I would say to somebody, ask your pastors. Look up a mainline seminary and shoot an email to a professor. More likely than not, they would be happy to respond with a suggestion or two of some things to read. Or a lot of seminaries too are starting to get on board with offering more webinars and continuing education experiences for people around issues of race too. Nonprofits as well, like Project Curate and others. Like there are more and more opportunities are developing, so there are ways to plug in. One thing that I found very helpful for me is I've been a part of a community organizing group, Together Louisiana. It's with the Industrial Areas Foundation, and I've done work with them for the last 4 years or so, and I've done work with other community organizing groups, faith-based, church-based community organizing groups back in Virginia, where I lived for a while. And part of the usually in those processes, you identify a social issue that the groups want to work on to try to solve. But they've always been very well done in terms of the racial and religious diversity that they bring together around the table for those processes. And what's been really beneficial is not just the issue that we work on to try to resolve in the community or at the state level, either one, but also the relationship building that happens out of sharing space. And usually if they're good organizers, which we've had, they're really good about making sure there's an equitable sharing of power and responsibility in those groups as well. And so you really you get to work on something beneficial for a community. And at the same time, you're building relationships across lines that we may not have the chance to cross in our everyday lives. And that's something that those organizations are largely lay driven, and we need lay people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Parts of that.
I love how he said send an email to a mainline seminary, not like an IFB, Independent Fundamentalist Baptist school.
I have my allergies to those.
Okay, just making sure.
The ones who grew up in that world, I know them well. They might surprise you, though. I don't know.
IFB.
As Matt said earlier, there's a Texas Pastors Council. It's mostly a Baptist organization, but they've sent sort of a plea to the Texas legislature that was. There's language now being spoken that is very different. I mean, I think now there is also in the Southern Baptist Convention, isn't there an African American president that was elected? Which when you look at the SBC history, it's not that many years ago that they kind of recognized racism and apologized for the history.
Yeah.
Of course, that's probably true of most denominations, if I had to guess, but. Well, tell me what you do. Yeah. What do you do for fun? Besides read all those books.
So, well, I want to frame for you where I am a little bit. Lake Providence I live a mile off the Mississippi River.
Nice.
I'm in the far northeastern corner of the state, about 15 miles from the Arkansas state line. Where I live, Lake Providence, we are about an hour and a half away from a Target. We're an hour and a half away from a Starbucks, a movie theater, at least one that's, anyway, yeah. It's a town of about 3,000 people with 2 restaurants in it. On 63% of our children live in poverty. 50% of adults live in poverty. There's no middle class that exists. Therefore, there are no middle class amenities in the area, not just in our town, but most Delta communities up and down the river. That's pretty normal. So I have to be creative in terms of what I do to maintain sanity and to get out and enjoy myself. But I love photography. Developed that over the years. Louisiana is beautiful. Louisiana has its struggles, but it's also a very beautiful state. The Delta is a beautiful region. It's very troubled. There's a lot of poverty, and it's still very beautiful, both in terms of the people who live here, but also the natural beauty as well. Spent a lot of time out kayaking, wildlife photography, getting out to the wildlife refuges. There are no national parks in Louisiana, which is interesting.
Wow.
But there are a lot of state and wildlife refuges and state parks as well. So there's a lot of nice places to get out when it's not 105 degrees and full of mosquitoes.
It's about 4 days out of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 weeks in the spring and 2 weeks in the fall. But that keeps me busy. Read a lot, do photography, stay pretty busy with work. So, stay in that. Love to cook, those kinds of things. You got to be creative and find ways to keep yourself going.
How did you get there? So you go do your Ph.D. and you end up in northeastern Louisiana in a real 3,000 person town. That's, how did you get to where you're at?
Well, I jokingly say, because I'm not trying to shame anybody, but I jokingly say I read liberation theology and I took it seriously. That was the method that I worked with in my program and had been reading for several years, which liberation theology is just the idea that Christians are called to be in places of oppression and poverty. And we are meant to find ways to make a difference in those places and to challenge the reasons why those conditions persist. That's one reason. That's the very noble reason why I was here. The other reason is that a PhD in theology is good for teaching in seminaries or divinity schools, but the job market is absolutely horrible for teaching in religious studies programs or seminaries or divinity schools. With the shrinking population of the church, there are shrinking budgets in seminaries and div schools. State education budgets, as they get slashed, the humanities are the jobs that go to adjunct status, so they're part-time, no benefits. You might make $8,000 or $9,000 a year. I've been teaching higher ed, college, and seminary level courses for the last 9 years, but it's very difficult to make a living from it. Yeah. So I've taught in seminaries, I've taught at colleges, I'm teaching at a university now on the side as an adjunct, and you just can't make a living from it. So I had to have something to do, and found this job description, and it said race, economics, poverty, check, deep South. Those are all the things that I've been stuck in a study carrel for 4 or 5 years researching and writing about this. And there had always been a strong part of me. And I think for most people who are moved by liberation theology, there's a strong sense of wanting to be involved in the work, not just from behind a desk or in terms of what I write. And that was a call. It worked out. The timing was there. And so off I went and came to Louisiana. And it's been a wonderful education. Just as valuable, if not more, than the PhD that I earned from what I've learned being in this community. I will be the first to say I didn't know that conditions like this still existed in the United States, and they do, and they're very present here. So it's been valuable work and challenging work and isolating work, but good work nevertheless.
That's great.
So tell us again your podcast and the organization that you are with, so people are aware of that.
Podcast is Progressive Southern Theologians. There's also a website where we publish lots of writing, sermons, essays, articles from colleagues and friends. What happened was, out of that context I just described 2 or 3 years ago, it became very lonely, and I felt like I'd left this one world where I had an identity as a scholar and a researcher, and came to a world where just drastically different and not as easy to fit in. And I found that I had a lot of other friends and colleagues who were in ministry and who were also more progressive in terms of their theologies and politics, and who were doing work in the South. But as you can imagine, doing that work in the South can be lonely and isolating in and of itself. And I had a lot of friends who were facing those challenges. And so we pulled together this website to kind of share our thoughts and just kind of say, hey, like there are progressive folk doing this work throughout the South. The South often gets a bad reputation, sometimes very well earned, but sometimes it can seem as if it's monolithically conservative evangelical or Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell country, and that overlooks the realities of folk who are doing good work here. So we try to lift up and elevate and put a spotlight on folks who are doing that type of thing. But we've started a podcast several months ago, so you can check that out too. The organization I'm with is called Together for Hope Louisiana. And so you can look up Together for Hope Louisiana and find our website and Facebook and things like that.
I've loved the website. I kind of fell down that rabbit hole about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and just some great writing. Your photography is on there as well. Found the podcast, which I've really enjoyed. Just the slow conversation that y'all are having. It's been really helpful to me. So thank you for that. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Mark, thanks for your time and for the good work that you're doing, and we'll have to get you over to Houston soon.
Love to.
That'd be great.
Love to come and visit.
We'd love that, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not too far away, so I would love to do that, and appreciate y'all doing what you all do. So thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for all your guidance and your help as well.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thanks.
All right, brother.
Y'all have a good
Blessings.
day.
Yeah.
We'll see you
All right.
soon.
See you
Bye-bye.
soon. Bye-bye.
So I don't know. I like Mark
I do too.
because I think whether it sounds good, bad, or indifferent, I think that and I don't know a nice way to say it or a good way or whatever, but white folk need ways to be invited into processing some of this. That's going to be non-threatening for some people, and I know how that sounds across different ears, and I'm just saying, not everybody. What he said, not everybody is at every place in the spectrum. Well,
right.
not every place is one place. People are all along the spectrum of this journey, and my goal is how can we get as many people across the broad spectrum to move in a direction to a greater sense of unity and really God's intended purpose.
Yeah. You know what Mark's helped me with is that because I have the tendency once I see something to be all in, and there's some really good things about that, and there's some not so good things about that, and he's helping me understand that it is, it's what Eugene Peterson calls a long obedience in the same direction, right? So it's a long journey that we're on, and that God's kindness and gentleness will get us all there. It's just going to happen unless we resist it and become just jerks. But God's going to work with us and liberate all of us.
Well, I think today is a nice way to defer to our elders. Since you're older than I am, I thought that you would kind of do the ending.
You're going to let me lead out?
Yeah, you do the ending, and I'll just do your part.
I'm John Stevens, and this is Pod Have Mercy.
No, that's not really what I meant.
Oh.
You do your name.
Oh, okay.
But then I'll do my name, and then you do the Pod Have Mercy.
Well, I am Matt Russell.
And I'm John Stevens.
And this is Pod Have Mercy.
Old man.
Oh, this is Pod Have
Mercy.
This is Pod Have Mercy.
Don't say pod too hard, your dentures will fall out.